The winter of 1808 descended on the iron peaks of Montana like a shroud, blanketing the mining settlement of Blackwater in silence so complete that even whispered prayers seemed to echo. In this landscape of frozen desperation, where families buried their dead with heirloom jewelry because coins were scarce, two figures offered salvation. Silas and Prudence Croft opened the doors of Marrow Chapel to any soul who needed rest, asking only for whatever small token the bereaved could spare. But beneath the chapel's consecrated floors, in a cellar that reeked of preservation salts and medicinal herbs, the Crofts were conducting a different kind of service entirely. Families who paid with silver lockets and pocket watches never knew their loved ones were being butchered and prepared as human meat, packaged with the same care as Sunday roast, then shipped along frozen trails to feed the literal cannibalistic appetites of Gilded Springs' most distinguished citizens. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. What the grieving families of Blackwater believed was Christian charity was actually the most profitable enterprise in the territory. This was not just crime. This was a cannibalistic operation that fed on human lives, sustained by grief and protected by a conspiracy of wealth and willful blindness that reached into the highest circles of Montana society. To understand how such a horror could flourish, you must first understand the landscape that concealed it. The iron peaks of Montana rise like ancient sentinels from the earth, their snow-capped summits catching the last light of winter days that barely lasted 6 hours. Between these mountains, carved into valleys that seemed designed to swallow sound and memory, lay two settlements separated by 20 miles of treacherous mountain trail, yet worlds apart in every way that mattered. Blackwater clung to the mountainside like a scar, a collection of hastily built shacks and company buildings clustered around the entrance to copper mines that had already claimed more lives than they had yielded fortunes. The settlement's 1,500 souls lived in a state of perpetual desperation, their existence dependent on the whims of mine supervisors and the mercy of Montana winters that could stretch from October to May. When men died in the tunnels, which happened with nauseating regularity, their families often lacked even the few dollars needed for a proper burial. A day's hard travel through mountain passes that became impassable for months at a time lay Gilded Springs, a town that might as well have existed in a different century. Here, in heated mansions built with mining fortunes, the territory's industrial elite gathered for elaborate dinner parties that lasted until dawn. These were men who owned not just the mines, but the railways that served them, the banks that financed them, and the politicians who protected them. They possessed appetites that ordinary provisions could never satisfy. Between these two worlds, positioned with what seemed like divine providence but was actually calculated precision, stood Marrow Chapel. The weathered stone building occupied a small plateau along the mountain trail, visible from both settlements yet belonging fully to neither. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade before the Crofts arrived, its previous minister having fled after what local records described only as an incident involving the desecration of graves. The chapel's isolation was its greatest asset. Travelers along the mountain trail rarely stopped, and those who did were usually too exhausted or too focused on their destination to pay attention to the activities of the building's occupants. The structure itself seemed designed for concealment, its thick stone walls muffling sound, its placement ensuring that smoke from any fires would be dispersed by mountain winds before it could be traced to its source. What seemed like salvation would become consumption, and the very remoteness that made the chapel a sanctuary also made it the perfect place to conduct business that required absolute privacy. Into this landscape of desperation stepped two figures who seemed heaven sent to the suffering souls of Blackwater. Silas Croft arrived first in late autumn of 1807, a tall man in his 40s with the kind of quiet authority that made people listen when he spoke. His hands bore the calluses of honest work, yet there was something about the way he examined the abandoned chapel that suggested familiarity with more delicate tasks. When questioned about his background, he spoke vaguely of medical studies back east, of a calling to serve the poor, of a wife who would join him once he had made the place suitable. Prudence Croft appeared with the first snows, a woman of perhaps 35 whose severe beauty was softened by an apparent dedication to charitable works. She carried herself with the careful precision of someone accustomed to managing complex household affairs, and within days of her arrival, the neglected herb garden behind the chapel began to flourish, even in the harsh mountain climate. Her knowledge of medicinal plants impressed even the settlement's aging doctor, who found her remedies for miners' lung ailments surprisingly effective. The couple worked through the brutal winter with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. While other buildings in Blackwater struggled with drafts and failing foundations, Marrow Chapel was transformed into a warm sanctuary that seemed to radiate comfort from its very stones. Silas rebuilt the altar with carved symbols that he claimed were ancient Christian motifs, though some of the older miners muttered that the designs looked suspiciously like the ritual markings found in abandoned native sites throughout the territory. More remarkable still was the couple's approach to their ministry. Unlike the fire and brimstone preachers who occasionally passed through Blackwater, the Crofts spoke softly of comfort and rest, of the dignity owed to every soul, regardless of their station in life. When the first deaths of spring came, as they always did when winter's grip finally loosened its hold on the weakest, Silas and Prudence offered their services free of charge to families who could afford nothing. Their only request was for some small token of remembrance, anything that had belonged to the deceased, or held meaning for the family. A pocket watch, perhaps, or a wedding ring, a locket with a loved one's portrait. They explained that these items would be blessed and incorporated into the chapel's growing collection of memorial artifacts, a practice that struck the grieving families as both touching and appropriate. By summer's end, the Crofts had become indispensable to Blackwater's spiritual life. Miners who had not set foot in a church for years found themselves attending Sunday services, drawn by Prudence's haunting hymns and Silas's sermons about finding purpose in suffering. When children asked their parents why the preacher and his wife never seemed to eat the food brought by grateful families, the adults simply assumed the couple preferred to maintain the dignity of their calling through self-imposed austerity. Their dedication earned trust that would prove tragically misplaced, for beneath the chapel's consecrated floors, the Crofts were preparing for a winter business that would transform grief into the territory's most profitable enterprise. The first sign that something was amiss came in early spring of 1808, when a drifter named Jacob Miller collapsed outside the mining office after 3 days of hard drinking. Miller was the kind of man who existed on society's margins, a former prospector whose luck had run out years before his liver gave way. He had no family, no friends willing to claim responsibility for his remains, and certainly no money for the kind of burial the church in Gilded Springs would have demanded. When word reached the Crofts, they responded with their characteristic compassion. Silas arrived within the hour, his wagon already prepared with clean linens and the dignity that every human soul deserved in death. The miners who had gathered around Miller's body watched with respectful silence as the preacher wrapped the remains with careful precision, murmuring what sounded like prayers but were spoken too quietly to understand clearly. The burial took place that same evening in the small cemetery behind Marrow Chapel, a simple service attended by perhaps a dozen souls who felt that even a drunk deserved better than an unmarked grave in the wilderness. Prudence sang a hymn that seemed to carry on the mountain wind long after her voice had stopped, and Silas spoke briefly about the mercy that awaited all who had suffered in this world. No payment was requested because none could be given, a gesture that only reinforced the community's growing admiration for their selfless shepherds. 3 weeks later, widow Beatrice Clay was hanging laundry behind her cabin when her dog came trotting home with what she initially assumed was a deer bone. The animal had been ranging farther than usual, probably drawn by the scent of spring melt revealing winter casualties throughout the forest. But when she took a closer look at the prize her pet had retrieved, she noticed something that made her stomach turn cold. The bone was perfectly clean, scraped of all tissue with a precision that suggested tools rather than scavengers. More disturbing still, it showed clear cut marks that ran perpendicular to its length, the kind of methodical sectioning that Beatrice recognized from her late husband's work as a butcher. Wild animals tore and gnawed, leaving ragged tears and tooth marks. This bone had been processed. She brought the evidence to Doc Hollis, the overworked coroner, who served both Blackwater and the smaller settlements scattered throughout the territory. Hollis examined the bone with the weary skepticism of a man who had seen too many strange deaths in too many remote places. His initial assessment, scribbled on a scrap of paper and filed away without ceremony, noted the unusually clean state of the remains and the presence of what appeared to be deliberate cut marks. But when pressed for an explanation, Doc Hollis shrugged and suggested that bears occasionally used rocks to break bones for marrow, or that the bone might have been cleaned by insects before the dog found it. His reluctance to investigate further stemmed not from laziness, but from a practical understanding of how accusations without proof could destroy a man's reputation in a territory where survival often depended on community trust. The incident was quietly forgotten, dismissed as one of those wilderness mysteries that periodically surfaced in mountain communities. Beatrice Clay mentioned it to a few neighbors, who nodded politely and changed the subject to more pressing concerns like mine safety and winter preparations. The bone itself disappeared, probably tossed into a refuse pile or used to flavor soup stock. It was a clue that required a context no one was yet willing to see, a puzzle piece that would only find its place after the machine was already in motion and the true cost of the Crofts' charity had become impossible to ignore. As autumn of 1808 settled over the Iron Peaks, bringing with it the promise of another brutal winter, two events converged to create what would later be recognized as the perfect storm for unspeakable commerce. The first was nature's cruelty. The second was human appetite, and together they would transform Marrow Chapel from a house of worship into something far more sinister. The winter that descended on Blackwater was unlike anything the old-timers could remember. By November, temperatures had already dropped to levels that typically didn't arrive until January, and the snows came early and heavy, sealing the mountain passes with drifts that would remain impassable until late spring. The mining company, faced with the impossibility of getting supplies through the blocked trails, made the pragmatic decision to suspend operations until the thaw, leaving most of the settlement's men without work or wages during the months when survival costs were highest. Desperation breeds accidents, and accidents breed death. On December 3rd, a support beam in the main tunnel gave way, trapping 11 miners in a collapse that took 3 days to clear. When the rescuers finally reached them, they found only bodies, and families already stretched to their breaking point suddenly faced the additional burden of burial expenses they could never afford. It was during this crisis that the true character of the Crofts revealed itself, though not in the way anyone expected. They opened Marrow Chapel to every family touched by tragedy, offering free burial services that seemed to represent the very essence of Christian charity. What no one realized was that Silas had already made contact with parties in Gilded Springs who possessed both the resources and the peculiar appetites necessary to make such generosity profitable. 20 miles away, in the heated drawing rooms of the territory's industrial elite, a different kind of desperation was taking hold. Matthias Corbin, whose import business had made him wealthy enough to indulge tastes that ordinary provisions could never satisfy, found himself lamenting the isolation that winter imposed on his social gatherings. The exotic delicacies that had made his dinner parties legendary throughout the territory were simply unavailable when the supply lines from distant cities were severed by snow and ice. Corbin's complaints were not mere inconvenience. They represented a genuine crisis of status among men whose power was measured not just in wealth but in their ability to provide experiences unavailable to lesser mortals. These were individuals who had grown bored with conventional luxuries, who craved the forbidden precisely because it was forbidden, and who possessed both the resources and the moral flexibility necessary to acquire whatever their appetites demanded. The connection between Blackwater's surplus of bodies and Gilded Springs' hunger for the exotic was established through channels that left no official record. Whether Silas approached Corbin or Corbin sought out Silas remains unclear, but by late December an understanding had been reached that would prove profitable for both parties and catastrophic for the families who trusted the Crofts with their most sacred obligations. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. The Crofts would continue their charitable work, accepting whatever tokens of payment the bereaved could provide, while ensuring that the actual remains were processed and preserved according to specifications that Corbin's clients would find acceptable. The remote location of the chapel and the isolation imposed by winter conditions created perfect operational security, while the community's gratitude would serve as protection against any inconvenient questions. Supply and demand would create a market in unthinkable goods, and the machine that would feed on Blackwater's grief was ready to begin its terrible work. What happened next in the cellar of Marrow Chapel represented a level of systematic efficiency that would have impressed the most hardened industrialist. The Crofts had transformed the basement of their house of worship into something that operated with the cold precision of a butcher shop, where grief was the raw material and human flesh became a delicacy measured by the pound for wealthy cannibals. The process began upstairs in the chapel proper, where everything appeared exactly as the bereaved families expected. Silas would conduct services with the same solemn dignity that had earned him the community's trust, while Prudence provided comfort with her haunting hymns and gentle words about eternal rest. The deceased lay in a simple pine coffin, surrounded by wildflowers and the soft glow of beeswax candles, while family members said their final goodbyes and pressed their treasured heirlooms into Silas's hands as payment for his sacred services. But once the mourners departed and darkness settled over the mountain plateau, the real work began. The body was carefully removed from its coffin and transported down a narrow stone staircase that most visitors to the chapel never knew existed. The cellar had been extensively modified during the Crofts' first winter, transformed from a simple storage space into a tiled chamber that could be thoroughly cleaned and sanitized after each butchering session. The room's most striking feature was its drainage system, a network of channels carved into the stone floor that directed all blood and fluids toward a central grate connected to underground pipes that carried human waste far from the chapel grounds. The walls were lined with hooks and shelves, holding an array of tools that would have been familiar to any experienced butcher, each implement kept in perfect condition and arranged with the kind of obsessive organization that spoke to years of practice in human dismemberment. Silas worked with the methodical precision of a man who had performed the same cannibalistic preparation countless times before. His medical training, whatever its true extent, had clearly included instruction in human anatomy, and he approached each corpse with a surgeon's understanding of how to separate tissue and bone with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. The process typically took 3 to 4 hours, during which every usable portion of human meat was carefully sectioned, cleaned, and prepared for preservation as food. Prudence's role was equally crucial, though less physically demanding. Her expertise with herbs and preservation techniques ensured that the human flesh could survive the journey to Gilded Springs while maintaining the quality that Corbin's cannibalistic clientele expected. She had developed a complex system of smoking, salting, and spicing that not only prevented spoilage, but actually enhanced the flavor of human meat in ways that ordinary animal flesh could never achieve. The packaging was done with the same care that a fine restaurant might use for its most exclusive offerings. Each portion of human meat was wrapped in clean cloth, labeled with cryptic markings that indicated cut and preparation method, then packed in wooden crates lined with sawdust and aromatic herbs. The containers themselves bore no identifying marks that could trace them back to Marrow Chapel, appearing to be nothing more than ordinary shipments of preserved game or imported delicacies. Transportation presented its own challenges, but the Crofts had developed relationships with traders who asked no questions as long as they were paid promptly and generously. These middlemen, who operated the supply routes between isolated settlements and larger towns, were accustomed to carrying cargo that their clients preferred to keep confidential. A few extra coins ensured that certain shipments of human meat would be delivered discreetly to specific addresses in Gilded Springs without appearing on any official manifests. The financial records of this cannibalistic enterprise were kept with meticulous care in 2 separate ledgers. The first recorded the payments received from bereaved families, a modest collection of pocket watches, jewelry, and family heirlooms that provided a legitimate front for the chapel's operations. The second, hidden ledger, tracked the real business, coded entries that documented weights of human flesh, preparations, and the substantial sums paid by cannibalistic clients whose appetites had made the entire operation profitable beyond the Crofts' most optimistic projections. If you are still watching, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this nightmare finally unraveled, because what happened next would expose not just the Crofts' horror, but the cannibalistic appetite of an entire community that preferred to feast on human flesh in the shadows. The chapel became a factory where grief was the raw material, and the machine operated with such terrible efficiency that it might have continued indefinitely if not for one man's love for his sister and his sharp eye for a piece of jewelry that should have been buried with the dead. The first crack in the Crofts' perfect operation came from Liam O'Connell, a miner whose devotion to his dead friend nearly cost him his life. When his longtime partner Thomas McKinnon died in a mine accident, O'Connell insisted on staying with the body through the night, a practice that was inconvenient for the Crofts' carefully timed operations. Silas attempted to dissuade him with gentle words about rest and divine protection, but O'Connell remained unmoved, positioning himself beside his friend's coffin for what he believed would be a night of prayer. The Crofts had no choice but to wait, though other bodies awaited processing in the hidden cellar. As hours passed, Prudence brought O'Connell coffee laced with herbs that she claimed would help him stay alert. What she provided was a mild sedative meant to cause sleep. The plan might have worked if O'Connell had not developed tolerance for such substances from years of treating mining injuries. Instead of deep sleep, he entered a drowsy half-consciousness, aware but appearing unconscious. Through heavy eyelids, he watched as Silas approached the coffin with excessive care. What he witnessed next shattered every assumption about Blackwater's most trusted spiritual guides. Silas lifted Thomas's body with practiced efficiency, disappearing through a door the miner had never noticed. The sound of footsteps descending stone stairs was followed by nearly an hour of silence. When Silas reappeared, he carried a canvas sack considerably heavier than anything that should be found in chapel storage. The preacher moved with nervous energy, glancing frequently at O'Connell's sleeping form. Most disturbing were the dark stains on Silas's sleeves and the unmistakable smell of blood that followed him from beneath the chapel floor. O'Connell remained motionless until dawn, when Silas approached with expressions of sympathy and suggestions that he return home. The performance was flawless, but O'Connell now heard cold calculation beneath the spiritual authority that had made the Crofts beloved. For 3 days he said nothing, wrestling with implications and trying to convince himself of innocent explanations. But the memory of that stained sack and the smell haunted his dreams. On the 4th day, fortified by whiskey and driven by loyalty, O'Connell confronted the Crofts directly. His accusations were slurred but clear enough to shock everyone within hearing distance. The reaction was swift. Reverend Hemlock denounced O'Connell as a drunkard whose grief had driven him to blasphemy. The miners turned their backs, unwilling to hear accusations against the couple who had provided comfort without asking for anything in return. Within a week, O'Connell became a pariah, shunned by neighbors who preferred faith in the Crofts to disturbing questions. His desperate letter to a cousin back east was rambling and barely coherent, his final attempt to find someone who would listen. 3 days after writing it, Liam O'Connell vanished from Blackwater entirely. The official explanation blamed wolves or exposure. But one man's doubt had planted seeds of discovery that would grow in another mourner's heart, someone with both evidence and determination to expose the truth. The man who would expose the Crofts' horror was Elias Vance, a miner whose devotion to his sister Eleanor bordered on obsessive. When Eleanor died of consumption in February of 1809, Elias paid for her burial with their mother's silver finch locket, the only jewelry their family had preserved through years of poverty. The locket was distinctive, crafted in Denver with delicate filigree surrounding a miniature songbird portrait. Eleanor had worn it daily since their mother's death, considering it her most precious possession. When Elias placed it in Silas Croft's hands as burial payment, he felt as though he was surrendering the last piece of his sister's identity. 3 weeks later, business took Elias to Gilded Springs to deliver mining reports to investors. While walking past Matthias Corbin's import shop, he noticed a jewelry display meant to attract wealthy clients. Hanging in the center, catching afternoon sunlight with familiar brilliance, was his mother's silver finch locket. The discovery hit like a physical blow. There was no possibility of mistake. The locket bore a small dent near the clasp from when Eleanor dropped it as a child, and the portrait showed the exact songbird Elias had memorized from watching his sister trace its outline. Elias burst through the shop door with startling urgency. Corbin explained with cool professionalism that he had purchased the locket from a reputable estate jewelry dealer. When pressed for details, he produced a receipt showing acquisition from Silas Croft, presented as part of a collection inherited from deceased parishioners. The revelation that his sister's treasured possession had been sold like common merchandise filled Elias with overwhelming rage. He confronted Corbin with accusations, claiming the locket should have been buried with Eleanor, and demanding to know what other items from Blackwater's dead had reached Gilded Springs shop windows. Corbin's response seemed reasonable. He explained that ministers commonly sold donated items to fund charitable activities, and families often contributed more jewelry than could practically be interred. He even offered to sell the locket back at a fair price, treating the confrontation as mere misunderstanding. But Elias knew with certainty that he had never authorized the sale. More disturbing was Corbin's casual reference to other Blackwater items, suggesting ongoing business relationship between merchant and minister. Elias returned to Blackwater in barely controlled fury, demanding Sheriff John Hale investigate the chapel immediately. Hale was reluctant to pursue what appeared to be a civil jewelry dispute. Only after Elias threatened to contact territorial authorities did Hale agree to conduct what he clearly intended as perfunctory investigation. The search was conducted with obvious reluctance. Silas welcomed the lawman with serene dignity, expressing understanding for a grieving brother's confusion while suggesting that grief sometimes clouded memory. The chapel appeared exactly as expected, clean and well-maintained, filled with comforting smells of beeswax and dried flowers. The cellar appeared to be nothing more than storage filled with preserved foods, medicinal herbs, and winter supplies. Sheriff Hale's cursory examination found nothing unexplainable as legitimate frontier ministry activities. His official report dismissed Elias's accusations as grief-induced paranoia, but Elias knew what he had seen, and he recognized the smug patience in Silas Croft's expression as the look of a man who believed himself untouchable. The truth was hidden in plain sight, but no one wanted to see what lay beneath Blackwater's most beloved institution. The official investigation had been a farce, but it had accomplished one crucial thing that Sheriff Hale never intended. During the search of the chapel, Elias had glimpsed something that the lawman either missed or chose to ignore: a leather-bound ledger sitting on Silas Croft's desk that had been hastily covered with a cloth when the authorities arrived. For weeks after the failed investigation, Elias found himself consumed by thoughts of that partially hidden book. Every rational part of his mind told him to let the matter rest, to accept that his sister was gone and that pursuing the Crofts would only bring more grief to his already shattered life. But the memory of Eleanor's locket gleaming in that shop window, sold like any other piece of merchandise, refused to let him find peace. The opportunity to act came on a night in late March when both Crofts had traveled to a neighboring settlement to conduct funeral services for a family that had perished in a cabin fire. Elias waited until well past midnight before approaching the chapel, his heart hammering with the knowledge that what he was about to do would brand him as a criminal in the eyes of his community if he were caught. Breaking into the chapel proved easier than he had expected. The lock on the side door was old and poorly maintained, yielding to pressure from a mining tool that Elias had brought for the purpose. Once inside, he moved carefully through the darkened sanctuary, using a hooded lantern to provide just enough light to navigate without alerting anyone who might be passing along the mountain trail. The office where he had glimpsed the ledger was located behind the altar, a small room that served as both study and storage area for the chapel's administrative needs. Silas's desk was neat and organized, everything arranged with the kind of methodical precision that suggested a mind comfortable with detailed record-keeping. The ledger itself sat exactly where Elias remembered seeing it, though it was no longer hastily covered, but positioned prominently as if its contents held nothing that required concealment. The first pages contained exactly what anyone would expect to find in a minister's record book. Names of the deceased, dates of burial, and brief notes about the services performed were all recorded in Silas's careful handwriting. But as Elias continued reading, patterns began to emerge that made his blood run cold with understanding. Next to each name was a notation indicating payment received, usually described in terms like silver locket, gold watch, or family ring. These entries matched what Elias knew about the Crofts' practice of accepting heirlooms as payment for burial services. But alongside these legitimate-appearing records were additional notations that used abbreviated terms and coded measurements that seemed to have nothing to do with funeral arrangements. The breakthrough came when Elias realized that the coded entries corresponded to weights and measurements detailed specifications that suggested systematic processing of something far more valuable than inherited jewelry. Cross-referencing the dates with his memory of deaths in the settlement, he began to understand the horrifying truth about what those measurements represented. But the most damning evidence lay in the ledger's final section, where Silas had recorded what appeared to be business transactions with parties in Gilded Springs. These entries used only initials to identify clients, but the sums involved were staggering, far exceeding anything that could be explained by the sale of donated jewelry or normal ministerial fees. The pattern was unmistakable once Elias understood what he was looking at. Each death in Blackwater generated two separate accounting entries, one recording the modest payment from grieving families, another documenting substantial income from unnamed clients whose appetites had made the entire operation profitable. Hidden among the desk papers, Elias discovered fragments of what appeared to be Prudence Croft's personal diary, pages that had been partially burned but not completely destroyed. The surviving text revealed a woman whose sanity was crumbling under the weight of what she and her husband were doing. Her handwriting, normally precise and controlled, became increasingly erratic as she described nightmares that refused to end and the haunting eyes of clients whose hunger seemed to grow with each delivery. Most disturbing of all were her references to preservation techniques and recipes for spices that would enhance flavor while preventing spoilage. The clinical detachment with which she discussed these preparations made clear that whatever humanity she might once have possessed had been systematically erased by months of unspeakable work. As Elias photographed page after page with a small camera he had borrowed for the purpose, the full scope of the Crofts' operation became clear. This was not the desperate crime of individuals driven to madness by isolation and hardship. This was a systematic business enterprise that had transformed human grief into a commodity, supported by detailed record-keeping and sustained by clients whose wealth protected them from consequences. The ledger held names of the dead and prices for the living, a meticulous accounting of horror that had operated with deadly efficiency, while the community willfully ignored every sign of what was happening beneath their feet. Armed with this evidence, Elias knew that confronting the Crofts directly was his only option, regardless of the danger such a confrontation might bring. The confrontation came 3 nights after Elias's discovery, when the Crofts returned from their journey to find him waiting in the chapel sanctuary with the ledger open on the altar before him. He had positioned himself deliberately in the space where so many families had said their final goodbyes, surrounded by the symbols of faith that the Crofts had perverted into instruments of commerce and horror. Silas entered first, his usual composure faltering only slightly when he saw Elias sitting calmly beside the evidence of their crimes. Prudence followed a moment later, and the sound she made when she recognized the ledger was less human cry than animal keen, the noise of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around her. For a long moment, the three of them existed in perfect stillness, as if movement might somehow make the situation more real than it already was. The chapel's familiar sounds, the creaking of settling timber, and the whisper of mountain wind through gaps in the stone seemed amplified in the silence that stretched between them. When Silas finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warm authority that had made him beloved throughout Blackwater. Instead, there was only the flat calm of a man who had been expecting this moment and had prepared himself for its arrival. He did not deny the accusations implicit in Elias's presence, did not attempt to explain away the evidence that lay open between them. Instead, he spoke of necessity and service, of a community that needed comfort in its darkest hours, and clients whose particular appetites created opportunities that would have been wasteful to ignore. His words carried the chilling logic of someone who had convinced himself that systematic horror was merely efficient business, that the transformation of human grief into profit represented a form of charitable recycling rather than the ultimate violation of trust. Prudence said nothing during her husband's calm explanation, but her eyes never left the ledger, and her hands moved constantly, wringing and twisting as if trying to wash away stains that had long since become permanent. When she finally did speak, it was to mutter fragmented prayers and apologies that seemed directed more toward the dead than toward Elias or any earthly authority. The confrontation might have ended there, with accusations and admissions that could eventually have been sorted out by proper authorities, if not for what happened next. As Silas continued his eerily reasonable explanation of their business practices, Prudence suddenly lunged toward the altar where the ledger lay open, her movements desperate and uncontrolled. Elias rose to intercept her, unsure of her intentions, but unwilling to let her destroy the evidence that proved their crimes. The collision between them was violent and clumsy, sending both sprawling toward the altar in a tangle of limbs and overturning the oil lamp that Elias had lit to read by. The lamp struck the wooden altar with a sound like breaking bones, and flame immediately began to spread through the dry timber and cloth that decorated the sanctuary. The fire took hold with a hunger that seemed almost alive, racing along the walls and ceiling with a speed that transformed the chapel from sanctuary to inferno in a matter of moments. In the chaos that followed, Silas displayed the same cold efficiency that had made their business so profitable. Rather than attempting to save the chapel or help his wife, he moved immediately toward the cellar stairs, presumably to destroy whatever evidence remained in their underground workshop. Prudence, meanwhile, seemed paralyzed by the spreading flames, her prayers becoming screams that mixed horror at the fire with deeper anguish about the lives they had consumed. Elias grabbed the ledger and fought his way through the smoke toward the chapel door, his lungs burning and his eyes streaming tears that blurred his vision. Behind him, he could hear Prudence calling for her husband, her voice growing more desperate as the flames cut off her path to the cellar where Silas had disappeared. The last thing Elias saw before stumbling out into the cold mountain air was Prudence turning back toward the fire, her movements deliberate now rather than panicked, as if she had made a decision that brought her a kind of terrible peace. Whether she was trying to reach her husband, destroy remaining evidence, or simply end her participation in their unholy enterprise, he would never know. When the flames finally died and the settlement's volunteers could safely approach the ruins, they found nothing that resembled human remains. Only ash and twisted metal from the chapel's furnishings. The official investigation would blame the fire on Elias's confrontation with the Crofts, painting him as a disturbed man whose grief had driven him to violence and arson. But the truth would be revealed in flame and fury, documented in the ledger that survived the blaze and the photographs that Elias had taken during his break-in. The evidence was undeniable, even if the community preferred to ignore its implications rather than confront the horror that had flourished in their midst. In the weeks that followed the fire, as Elias pored over the photographs and ledger entries he had rescued from the flames, a pattern emerged that was far more disturbing than even his worst suspicions had suggested. What he had initially believed to be the desperate crimes of two individuals driven to madness by isolation and opportunity was revealed to be something infinitely more systematic and protected. The coded initials in the ledger's final pages corresponded not to random clients, but to some of the most prominent names in Gilded Springs society. MC was clearly Matthias Corbin, but the other entries painted a picture of an entire network of wealthy individuals whose appetites had created a sustainable market for the Crofts' services. These were not occasional indulgences, but regular orders, scheduled deliveries that suggested the kind of ongoing business relationship that could only exist with institutional protection. More disturbing still were the financial records which revealed the true economics of the operation. The heirlooms and jewelry that grieving families had surrendered as payment were worth perhaps a few $100s in total, modest compensation that barely covered the costs of maintaining the chapel's legitimate activities. But the payments from Gilded Springs clients ran into the thousands, sums that dwarfed anything that could be earned through conventional means in the territory. The Crofts had not been wealthy predators exploiting the poor for personal gain. They had been suppliers, middlemen in a commerce that fed the appetites of individuals whose social position and economic power made them untouchable by conventional law enforcement. The chapel's remote location and the community's desperate gratitude had provided perfect cover for an operation that served clients whose wealth could purchase not just exotic provisions, but the silence necessary to enjoy them without consequences. Most damning of all was the discovery that the arrangement predated the Crofts' arrival in Blackwater by several months. Correspondence hidden in the ledger's binding revealed that Silas had been recruited for this specific purpose, chosen not for his religious calling but for his medical knowledge and willingness to work in isolated conditions. The entire charitable ministry had been a carefully constructed front designed to provide access to bodies while maintaining the community's trust and cooperation. This revelation reframed everything that had happened since their arrival. The restoration of the chapel, the cultivation of community relationships, even the systematic approach to record-keeping, all had been planned elements of an operation designed to serve appetites that ordinary meat could never satisfy. The tunnel collapse and harsh winter that had provided such an abundant supply of bodies had been fortunate circumstances rather than the catalyst for desperate crimes. Understanding the true scope of the conspiracy explained why Sheriff Hale's investigation had been so perfunctory and why the community's reaction to O'Connell's accusations had been so uniformly hostile. The operation had been protected not just by isolation and trust, but by a network of influence that reached into the highest levels of territorial society. Those who might have investigated were either bought, intimidated, or simply convinced that maintaining the status quo was preferable to confronting truths that would destabilize the entire social order. The fire had been no accident or act of desperation. Analysis of the burn patterns and the speed with which the flames had spread suggested that the chapel had been prepared for destruction, probably with accelerants hidden in strategic locations. The Crofts had likely triggered the fire themselves when they realized that exposure was inevitable, destroying evidence while creating a narrative that would blame Elias for their deaths and the loss of incriminating documents. But they had underestimated his determination and preparation. The photographs and ledger pages he had secured during his break-in provided undeniable proof of systematic murder and commerce in human flesh. More importantly, they revealed that the chapel had been just one node in a larger network that extended throughout the territory and probably beyond. The most frightening truth was not that two individuals had committed unspeakable crimes, but that an entire system had been created to feed the appetites of the wealthy and powerful. The Crofts were replaceable, their operation easily relocated to another isolated community where poverty and gratitude would again provide perfect cover for systematic horror. The chapel was just one piece of a much larger feast, and somewhere in the territory's mining camps and frontier settlements, other suppliers were probably already establishing themselves, earning trust and preparing to transform human grief into the kind of exotic provisions that money could buy, but conscience would never permit. The true horror was not a lone mad couple in the wilderness, but the civilized appetite that created and sustained them, and hunger that would simply find new sources to feed it once the old ones were destroyed. The official inquest into the Marrow Chapel fire convened 6 weeks after the blaze in the Gilded Springs Courthouse, where Territorial Judge Harrison Caldwell presided over proceedings remarkable for what they ignored rather than examined. The hearing lasted 3 days, creating the appearance of thorough investigation while ensuring no uncomfortable questions about the Crofts' true activities. Elias Vance was called as primary witness, but his testimony about the ledger and photographs was dismissed as fevered imaginings of a man whose grief had driven him to break into consecrated property and confront innocent ministers with wild accusations. Judge Caldwell repeatedly interrupted attempts to present physical evidence, ruling that documents obtained through illegal entry were inadmissible. The official verdict blamed the fire on Elias's confrontation with the Crofts, describing it as tragic accident when a grieving brother's delusions led to violence against people who had shown his family kindness. The Crofts were posthumously praised for charitable work, with emphasis on their willingness to serve the poor without payment beyond simple remembrance tokens. Sheriff Hale testified that his chapel investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing, describing the Crofts as model citizens whose only crime was excessive generosity. Most tellingly, Matthias Corbin appeared as character witness, describing Silas as honest dealer in estate jewelry. When asked about the silver Finch locket, Corbin produced documentation showing purchase from legitimate Denver estate sale, not from Silas Croft. The testimony was brazen perjury, but delivered with such confidence and seemingly credible documentation that even Elias began doubting his memory. The conspiracy's power lay not just in silencing opposition, but in rewriting history to make truth seem like madness. The inquest recommended banning Elias from Blackwater for destroying the settlement's spiritual institution. More ominously, it suggested his accusations and behavior indicated mental instability, posing danger to other communities. The threat was clear: continue these allegations and face asylum commitment. Faced with this choice, Elias left the territory entirely, traveling east beyond Gilded Springs' influence. The ledger and photographs went with him, but without official support, they became merely an exile's obsessions, whose story grew unbelievable with each telling. The chapel site was left to ruin, its blackened foundation serving as monument to what official records claimed was tragedy rather than justice. Within months, Forrest reclaimed the land, and the mountain trail became overgrown and impassable. The most effective silence came through the community's desperate need to believe their trust had not been betrayed. Miners and families who had benefited from Crofts' charity found it easier to accept that Elias was mad than confront their unwitting participation in systematic horror. Within a year, the Crofts were remembered as martyrs who died helping a disturbed man whose grief had twisted into violence. The story became local mythology, told around winter fires as cautionary tale about letting sorrow overwhelm reason. Official memory buried the truth deeper than any grave, and the machine that had fed on human flesh found new suppliers where poverty and gratitude would again provide perfect cover. More than a century later, the ruins of Marrow Chapel still draw the curious and the morbid to the overgrown plateau where Silas and Prudence Croft once conducted their unholy business. The foundation stones, blackened by fire and weathered by decades of mountain winters, rise from the forest floor like broken teeth, while twisted metal fragments from the chapel's furnishings glint occasionally through the undergrowth that has claimed the site. Local hiking guides mention the ruins in passing, usually with sanitized stories about a tragic fire that claimed the lives of 2 devoted ministers who had dedicated themselves to serving the poor. The official version has become so embedded in regional folklore that most visitors never suspect They are standing above what may have been one of the territory's most systematic killing grounds. But the mountain communities that surround the old site harbor different memories passed down through generations of families whose ancestors lived through those terrible months of 1808 and 9. Elderly residents of settlements that once traded with Blackwater still speak in hushed tones about the Hungry Chapel, a place where grief was transformed into something unspeakable, and the dead never found rest. These whispered legends have taken on lives of their own, evolving into cautionary tales about the dangers of trusting outsiders who offer help without asking for payment, and about the appetites of wealthy men whose hunger can never be satisfied by ordinary means. Children are warned not to venture near the ruins alone, not because of any supernatural danger, but because the site represents a violation of trust so profound that it continues to poison the mountain air. Modern investigators who have attempted to research the Marrow Chapel case find themselves confronted by the same wall of silence and misdirection that protected the conspiracy during its active years. Official records remain sealed or have mysteriously disappeared, while local authorities discourage inquiries by suggesting that disturbing old graves serves no useful purpose and only causes pain for the descendants of those involved. More disturbing are the parallels that emerge when the Marrow Chapel case is viewed alongside contemporary scandals involving the exploitation of the vulnerable by those in positions of trust. The same patterns repeat across centuries and continents. Isolated communities dependent on outside authority, systematic abuse disguised as charity, and networks of wealth and influence that protect perpetrators while discrediting victims. The story of Marrow Chapel serves as a reminder that the appetite for forbidden flesh has never been limited to the primitive or uncivilized, but flourishes most successfully in societies where wealth can purchase not just exotic provisions, but the silence necessary to enjoy them without consequence. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Those with power consume those without it, while institutions designed to protect the innocent instead protect the guilty. Recent investigations into trafficking networks and organ harvesting operations reveal organizational structures remarkably similar to what Elias Vance documented in his photographs of the Crofts Ledger. The same careful record-keeping, the same coded transactions, the same systematic approach to transforming human suffering into profit for clients whose wealth insulates them from consequences. The specifics fade into legend, but the underlying hunger remains, waiting for the right conditions to surface once more. In refugee camps and disaster zones, in places where poverty makes people desperate and isolation makes witnesses disappear, new versions of Marrow Chapel continue to operate with the same terrible efficiency that once fed the appetites of Gilded Springs elite. The ruins stand as testament not just to past horrors, but to present dangers that most people prefer not to acknowledge. The Hungry Chapel was not an aberration, but a warning, a glimpse into the systematic evil that emerges when human appetite encounters unlimited resources and insufficient oversight. When all the theories have been debated and all the official denials have been issued, when historians have dismissed the evidence as folklore and authorities have sealed the records that might provide answers, one undeniable truth remains. The ledger exists. The leather-bound book that Elias Vance rescued from the flames of Marrow Chapel sits today in a private collection, its pages yellowed with age, but its contents still legible to anyone with the courage to examine them. The ink has faded but not disappeared, and the systematic recordings of names, dates, weights, and payments tell a story that no amount of official revisionism can erase. The names in that ledger correspond exactly to the burial records maintained by Blackwater's mining company, cross-referenced dates that match the deaths recorded in the settlement's official documents. The coded measurements beside each entry follow patterns that become clear once you understand what they represent: the systematic butchering of human bodies for consumption by wealthy cannibals who paid premium prices for exotic meat. The client initials scattered throughout the ledger's final pages can still be traced to prominent families in Gilded Springs, men whose descendants continue to wield influence in Montana's political and business circles. The sums recorded beside those initials represent payments that dwarf anything that could be earned through legitimate means in that time and place, transactions that only make sense if you accept what the evidence clearly indicates: a thriving market in human flesh. Most damning of all are Prudence Croft's diary fragments, recovered from the desk where she had tried to burn them before the fire consumed everything else. Her handwriting deteriorates across the surviving pages, documenting the mental collapse of a woman who spent months preparing human meat for the dinner tables of the territory's elite. Her recipes for preservation spices, her notes about enhancing flavor, her increasingly frantic prayers for forgiveness all paint a picture of systematic cannibalism disguised as Christian charity. The physical evidence is supported by testimony that was dismissed at the time, but becomes compelling when viewed alongside the documentary proof. Liam O'Connell's letter to his cousin, describing his witness to Silas carrying a sack of meat from the cellar, takes on new significance when read in conjunction with the ledger's detailed records of processing weights and delivery schedules. Even the official inquest, designed to discredit rather than investigate, inadvertently preserved evidence that supports the cannibalistic interpretation of events. Judge Caldwell's dismissal of the ledger as fabricated becomes less convincing when the document's paper and ink are subjected to modern forensic analysis that confirms its age and authenticity. The fire that destroyed Marrow Chapel may have eliminated much of the physical evidence, but it could not erase the systematic record-keeping that the Crofts maintained with such deadly precision. Whatever else may be disputed about the events of 1808 and 9, the ledger's existence proves that something far more sinister than simple burial services was taking place in that isolated mountain chapel. The truth about Marrow Chapel challenges everything we prefer to believe about human nature and civilized society. It reveals that the appetite for forbidden flesh has always existed among the wealthy and powerful, protected by networks of influence that can transform victims into perpetrators and evidence into fantasy. Subscribe if you want to uncover more truths that powerful people buried alongside their victims, because the ledger remains, and its pages still whisper the names of those who were consumed not just by death, but by the systematic evil that fed on their flesh. The ledger exists, the names are real, the measurements are precise. Whatever happened in the cellar of Marrow Chapel, it was documented with the same care that any profitable business would use to track its most valuable inventory: human beings transformed into meat for those whose hunger could never be satisfied by ordinary provisions. In the end, that may be the most terrifying truth of all. This was not madness or desperation, but commerce conducted with the efficiency and record-keeping of any successful enterprise. The main course was always trust, but the feast itself was built on human flesh, and the appetite that created it continues to hunger in the shadows of our civilized world.